bind a quilt, and also giving you tips and tricks on how to bind a quilt and let the binding be not so painful for you. So let's go ahead and get started with that. I am Deanna from Stitches Quilting, and I am here to teach you all the tips and tricks that I know about with binding, but I want you to share your tips and tricks too. So let me go ahead and just go right here. Oh, Amanda, it says I have no sound. Let me fix it. Are we getting sound? Let's see. One moment. And let's see. Is there sound now? Is there sound now, you guys? Okay, I hope so. Oh, dear. Okay, press your button again for sound. Can you guys hear me? Let's see. Let's see. I might have to just... okay, you guys have no sound. Darn it. Can you guys hear me now? Because I am going to just keep going with this video. Yes. Okay. Then I press the button, and we're going to keep it pressed and make sure that happens. So let me start over one more time. Just be patient for me one more time, and I'll remove the beginning part of the video. We are working on binding a quilt, and I'm going to teach you all my tips and tricks on how to bind a quilt, because it's one of the most favorite part of the binding process, of the quilting process for me, is binding a quilt. It just is, it's such a sign that I finished something, I've accomplished something, and I love just sealing up all of these unfinished areas to the quilt and getting the quilt so it's just utterly beautiful, and it's sealed up and can be used. So that's one of the reasons why I love the binding a quilt. You also have to remember, you only have to go around the circumference of the quilt 2 times. You stitch around the circumference of the quilt 2 times. You might do one that is machine and do one that is hand stitch, or you might machine stitch both of them. So just think of your binding as going around the circumference of your quilt 2 times. That's all it is. 4 sides. It's easy as can be. So don't make it overwhelming. Okay, I have a question for you. Why do we as quilters have a double-lined binding? So if anybody can answer that question, why do we double over fabric for our binding? So think about that question and see if you guys can answer it, and let me know what you think. And also, what width of binding do you guys use? Put in the comments what width of binding that you actually use. Some people use a 2-inch binding, some use a 2 1/4, some use 2 1/2, and some might even use something even wider than that. And when do you use different width bindings? For me, I use a different width binding based on the loft of the batting that I'm using and the type of the batting that I'm using and the type of backing fabric that I'm using. So I might go a little bit wider yes, Lynette, because the binding wears out the quickest. So that's why we have a double layered binding, is because the binding is constantly being touched and handled and all of those kinds of things because it has the most wear and tear. So we go ahead and we fold our fabric in half and we press that. First, I want to go through how we sew together our bindings. So that is definitely right. So depending on what width I'm using, I do that based on my fabric backing and the batting that I'm using. Okay, now I have another strip of binding. Here it is. It's right here on the floor. So let's go ahead and change the camera angle. And I am going to show you how to prepare your binding to be sewn together in strips. We typically, when you're reading a pattern, you cut your binding fabric off of your fabric, and you're going from selvage to selvage. So in the quilting world, that is called width of fabric, WOF. So if you see that acronym in a pattern, WOF stands for width of fabric. So what we do when we join some pieces together of binding fabric is one of the first things what we need to do is we need to trim off our selvages. So the selvage is where it has the printing from the fabric designer, and it also has little tiny holes in it. So we want to trim off our selvages. This is where it was actually hooked on the machines where the fabric was manufactured. So we don't need these selvages, so we're going to trim off our selvage ends. So I'm going to go ahead and just use my little ruler here and grab my rotary cutter and then close the blade in case it falls. And then what we're going to do is we are now going to take our two ends of our that we're using. So we're going to take our two ends of the fabric and we are going to diagonally sew these together, because the goal of your binding is to always have the least amount of bulk. So you want to take your binding, whatever the width of your binding is that you're working on, and you want to mark that at a 45-degree angle. So whatever the width of your binding is, you want to mark that. You can stick a pin in it if you need to, and I'll go ahead and just do that because I want to show you, you don't normally want to go over your pins with your sewing machine. You're going to bring this over to your sewing machine, and I put up my third camera today for this video so that you can go ahead and see this a little bit better, but I'm going to then go and just stitch right on my penciled line. So let's go ahead and bring this down. And another tip I have for you is to actually use your walking foot. So I have my walking foot on here, and that is how you join the binding. I'm sorry, I have black thread there for you. So you can see that is joined right there. Let's go back to the overhead camera, and I'm going to show you now, you want to go ahead and trim off this excess fabric right here on your binding corners. So let's go ahead and just trim that off and toss it away. Now we need to press your binding, and I'm going to show you a really fast trick and hack I have for that. So on this fabric, the goal is to press this in half, right? Because we want a nice and sturdy fabric. You can press open your binding, your seam allowances to join your binding strips that are typically with the fabric. For this quilt, you will need 8 strips that are your to put on your binding. And to figure out your length of binding, you just take the circumference and add it up. Okay, so now I just lay my iron just down flat, and then I run it through. But I want to show you a really quick tip before I do that. When I join my binding, I want to remove as many pain points. So I actually, when I'm folding this, I am going to leave a little lip edge right there, right along the edge of the binding, okay? So I can for sure know that I am catching both sides of that fabric when I am attaching it to the quilt. And then you don't roll over the binding and see like a raw edge hanging out on your front. I typically attach my binding to the front of my quilt, and then I am just running this through my sewing machine, and you can see this, I'm using this with a small segment of binding fabric, but I just kind of run it underneath my iron and just pull that through, and that kind of removes the pain point of all the pressing that you need to do, and it really kind of keeps it on track. So you can see I've ironed I can lift up my iron so it's not disturbing, but you can see that I've got a small little lip edge right there. So I haven't folded it perfectly in half, almost perfectly, but I like that little lip edge. Okay, so let's move the pressing mat and let's come back over to the quilt. So I've pre-attached this binding for you, and I've started it because I didn't want this video to be very long. I chose a black fabric. It's this little tiny sweet fern fabric that's on here, and I just thought that I've used this in the quilt, and I just thought this would be a beautiful accent to the quilt itself. I've used the buffalo plaid for the backing, and then these fabrics right here that are in the bundle for the front of the quilt. So the pattern and the bundle are available for sale. So now I'm going to attach this on here. I've got this really closely pressed right here. So you can see, I can't necessarily see where that side end is. And that is what I want to avoid. I like having this lip edge right here, because when I'm doing my 1/4 inch stitch of attaching this binding to this, I can actually see that I've caught the back side of the fabric. If I somehow, this was just slightly off on this side, I might not get that caught up. So I just wanted you guys to see exactly how that works. Let's go ahead and switch it over to our sewing machine camera, and let me show you how I'm doing this. Once again, I'm using the walking foot, but I need to keep track of my 1/4 inch seam. So I have a piece of washi tape here on my sewing machine, and I'm going to follow this edge of the washi tape but a walking foot does not have that indicator on there. Here's where I ended my binding, and I'm going to go ahead and take my sewing machine just back over here. And you can see that I'm following this, the washi tape as I'm putting this on. Using a binding, a walking foot helps you not have to work as hard as you're pushing the fabric through, because your walking foot is helping you push it through on the top side and the bottom side. And I just love folding up, closing up this entire raw edge right here. You can see when I get over to where I have left a lip edge, because that's a frustrating point for me, is when I roll this over and I can see the raw edge hanging out after all that work. So I leave a little bit of a lip edge there, and when I do, then I can see that I am for sure, and it's probably about 1/8 of an inch that I'm allowing to show. So I just bring this over. Now, don't be overwhelmed by the corners. The corners are super simple. The goal is you want to end the corner, is you want to end right 1/4 of an inch from this side of the corner of the quilt, and you want to end your binding on this side. You want to stop stitching right at that 1/4 of an inch point right there. You don't want to stitch all the way down. You want to just stop right at that one little point on the end. That's 1/4 of an inch approximately on both sides of the quilt. So let's go ahead and bring this up, and I can feel where my fabric is right there. I can feel where it is right here. I'm going to stop 1/4 of an inch from that end. I'm also going to just hold my fabric here, and it's going to knot it just slightly, okay? I'm going to pull up my needle, and I'm going to trim that thread. So let's go ahead and check how that went. When I pull this back, you can see I've got 1/4 of an inch left there on the edge. So, and this doesn't have to be an exact science. Then on this corner, you're just like it's your folding presents for Christmas or for a birthday. You're going to fold this up at a 90-degree angle, right like that. So just fold it straight up. Do a small little finger press right there. That's all that's needed. And that's why you've ended that right at that 1/4 of an inch, is because we want that to go all the way up into the far corner of that. I'm going to fold it straight down over that 45-degree angle, fold it straight down, and I'm going to finger press it again. So then the goal of this is to start your binding 1/4 of an inch from the top and the edge. So about right where you stop. That's the goal. So, and you can feel that ridge of fabric where that fold is. So your goal is to put your needle down right where that ridge of fabric is. That's the goal. But remember, everything doesn't have to be perfect, but that's what you're trying for. I'm once again going to lay this back down, and I will go ahead and stitch, and I'm going to show you what that corner looks like. So let's go ahead and put on this binding. See how fast it goes? It's just crazy, crazy fast. So, and it's only going around the quilt, the circumference 2 times. Let's take a look at that corner now. So you can see when I pull this corner over, I've got a really beautiful corner right there in that edge. You can see that right there, and it's just really crisp and nice by leaving that 1/4 inch seam. And then when I fold this over on the other side, I can also get a crisper corner by bringing that around like that. Does that make sense? It just makes it easier for the fold. Okay, now when you start a binding, you are going to leave a long tail on the top of your binding right here. And let's move over to the other angle of the camera, because I'm going to show you, because I've sewn this now completely around the circumference of the quilt, except I have left a gap opening here. So we're going to lay this quilt down, and I usually start my binding at the bottom of the quilt. All right, so down here at the bottom of the quilt. And you can see I've got these bindings right now, and I want to bring them together and join them. The secret sauce of this is whatever you're using. So I'm leaving a gap so that I can go ahead and join them and have an easy time joining these together. So I've got room to stitch and to do this maneuver. What I want to do is to take a piece of your binding. So it doesn't matter what width of binding you're going to use. You are just going to use a piece of your own binding that you have left over, and you're going to lay this down right here. So I'm going to lay this side down. Let me go ahead and just trim off that end. I'm going to lay this down just nice and flat, and I'm going to lay my other edge on top. I'm going to trim this off to about right here because I've got a pretty good opening going there. All right, so that's my opened end. And remember, it's stitched back to here, and it's just open right there. And now I'm going to lay this one on top. When I lay this on top, what I want to do is actually take the width of my binding, lay it right there by the end of the first tail that I started with, and I'm going to lay this binding on top of that. All right? So, and we're going to just trim off this size. So you need exactly the overlap that of the width of the fabric of your binding. If that's 2.5 inches, that will be 2.5 inches. I just use this. I always use typically a 2-inch binding because I love using a 80-20 natural batting that's wool and cotton fabric. So I don't really use a loft very often. Now I'm going to take these two points right here, and I am going to lay them on top of each other right like that. Okay, and we're going to stick a pin in it. So let's go ahead and stick a pin in there. And then what my goal is to once again to then I'm going to draw a diagonal line right here, and I'm going to stitch this across that diagonal line, okay, on my sewing machine. And that is going to close it at the very, very most perfect space, and we'll have it closed on the diagonal because there is less bulk in the quilt. So let's go ahead and switch the camera back over to the sewing machine. So I've taken these 2 tails that I've carefully measured, and I'm just going to stitch right on that diagonal line and join these 2 ends of it. It really doesn't take much to think about it. You're just laying those down according to your width of fabric of your binding. Okay, here we go. So I'm going to go ahead and just stitch that closed. I'm going to come up, and I'm using black thread with this black binding. So there you have it. It's completely joined right here. I'm going to trim off my excess fabric. You could use a pair of scissors, which let's go ahead and do that right now. I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. Or you can use your rotary blade. You're going to open this up, and when it folds, so you have it open like this, it will naturally just fold in a really good position. Let's go ahead and look at that on the overhead camera just real quickly. So I joined these together. I stitched off my excess fabric. I'm now just closing this up, and look at how that just perfectly fits for exactly what we need to close our binding. So let's go ahead and take this back over to the sewing machine camera, and let's finish stitching this on. And I'm going to show you how to finish a binding. There's many ways that you can do this. I always attach, personally, I attach my bindings to the front of my quilt, and then I wrap it around to the back of my quilt. So let's go ahead and make sure that this is closed all the way. All right, there we go. So that is completely attached. So the front binding is completely attached to the front of the quilt. Look at that, it's so pretty. Okay, so that was just going around the quilt on the one circumference. You're just going around the quilt one time. Now we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna wrap that binding around, and I've got some extra threads kind of floating around. Let me go ahead and trim them. Wish I had my little smaller scissors here, but that's okay. Been sewing outside. So now we're just gonna take our quilt and we're gonna move it around. Let me turn this around so it's to the back of the quilt. Oh, you guys, I'll have to show you how the quilting turned out on this. It turned out so beautiful. So now what we're going to do is just wrap this around to the front. Easy as can be. Your goal, if you're going to machine, you can machine stitch your binding on, which sometimes I do, especially when I'm working on a quilt that might be for a child and I really want them to use it lots. Or I might hand quilt the binding around, which is what I prefer to do. But I'm going to show you how to machine that binding around. So we're just taking it and wrapping it. Since I left my little edge, I don't have any raw fabric showing there on the edge. And now we're going to wrap this around to the front. When you're machine quilting, when you're machine wrapping this around to the front, your absolute goal is to do a stitch on top of what you already stitched. So you can see this stitch right here. What we want to do as we wrap this around to the front, we want to stitch on top of that stitch. If we stitch on top of that stitch, then we are going to have a stitch in the ditch on the front. If you stitch just slightly to the right of your stitch, then on your front, it's going to stitch on top of your binding itself. If you stitch and pull this over a little bit too far, and you stitch to the left of your original stitching line, then when you stitch that, when you look at that, your stitching will come through all the way over here on the edge, on the inside of the quilt. So the goal is to stitch exactly on your stitching line. So let's go ahead and try that out. It gets to be something that you feel for, and that you look for, and you just have a general idea. I'm going to switch the camera back over to the sewing machine camera, and let's go ahead and look at that. So the goal is to stitch exactly on top of that stitching line. Hi, Belle. Hi, Mary. You know what? Binding a quilt really is easy, and it isn't something to be overwhelmed by. So let's go ahead. We're going to feel this and feel what it feels like, where you can feel that edge where you already stitched the fabric on the front of your binding. I'm going to just roll this over. I'm not going to roll it super tight. I'm just going to roll it with a natural roll. And then I'm going to try to stitch right on top of where I already stitched before. I'm going to have my needle always be in the down position for all of my stitching. All right. And I'm just going to gently feed that through. Remember, if you're doing this method, you only have to stitch around the circumference of your quilt one time. So just think about it as that way. And we're just going to feed that a little bit more through. And I can get a sense of where that is based on, you know, what I'm feeling, the fabric as it's flowing through. And I can get a sense for that. But now let's take it back and let's look and see what happened. Okay, let's look at that. All right, it's stitched on right here. And let's turn it around. You know what? This is really black on black thread. I really should be using a thread like a yellow or something that screams out where the stitch line is. So my stitch line is just, you can't see it here on the back of my fabric right here, but my stitch line is just slightly nested in there and on the black binding itself. I should change my thread to be just slightly yellow or something like that so you can see this a little bit better. Okay, so that's how you machine finish a binding, and you would just go around the quilt 2 times. But I am going to show you the hand method too. So let's go ahead and just bring this over. I have a needle with blue thread on it. And I've picked the blue thread so you guys can actually see me stitching, which maybe I'll change my needle thread so you can see me do the top part too. Let's go ahead and go over to this edge, and I will hold up this quilt so you guys can see the beautiful quilting on it. Okay, so right here, I've got a needle, and I am doing a double strand because I don't want that thread to break, all right? When I start my thread and my needle and thread, I'm going to start over here on my batting, and I'm going to thread that through the batting, and my knot is on the back side of this right here. So it's going to knot through. Oh, sorry. I guess I didn't do a very good knot. Let's go ahead and just tie that one more time. That's pretty funny. Okay, here we go. Let me do one more because I didn't kind of match up. You know when your knots don't match up. So there we go. That works. Okay, so now I'm going to, once again, sew this into my binding so that my binding is going to help me hold my knot in place. And I'm also going to just travel through my batting and the edge of the quilt for just a tiny little bit of time. The more that is embedded into your binding, the more secure it's going to be. When I bring this over, and oh my goodness, I love hand binding a quilt. When I bring this over, I'm going to just come down and I'm going to go right on the edge of that fabric. So we're going to pull this like this. And I don't know, just binding a quilt is just such a luxurious feeling because you've worked so hard on the quilt itself. And I love to see all of these raw edges just finished and completely finished. So I'm wrapping my binding around and I'm using a blue thread, but I'm going to show you how you can do this where your thread isn't seen. Although it's really kind of modern right now to have your thread be seen. So I pulled that up right there. So there you might see quilts where you can actually see the whole binding stitching. They're doing almost like a decorative stitch on there with hand, almost like with an embroidery floss. I'm going down exactly where this thread just came up. I'm going down right there, and then I scoot over through the layers of the fabric, not going all the way through, and I'm coming back up. So you can see, even though I'm using blue thread, you really can't see that first stitch very much at all. So I'm going to bring this over. Let's go back down right where we started, where that thread came up. I'm going to travel underneath and come back up. And you can see, you just, even using blue thread, it isn't very obvious where this came. So I go back down, and I love hand binding a quilt because it's a time when I can take my quilt someplace else other than my sewing machine. And when I hand bind the quilt, I can take it outside and go enjoy the outdoors. I can go over to my couch and chat with some family members. I can go take it to a sporting event that maybe my kids or my grandchildren are performing in and bind it when I'm there. I can take it in my car when I'm running errands, and when I just want to take a break from the day of running errands, I can just sit in my car or picking up or carpooling kids. I love binding a quilt. I do, and I love doing it by hand. I love doing it by machine, whichever way works. But binding a quilt and to just see that beauty rather than those raw edges and those extra threads just floating around, it's just so beautiful. It's like everything that we've been trying for and working towards is this beautifully bound quilt section, isn't it? And you can see, I've only been doing this for a short time, but look at how beautiful that is. And I love to keep turning it back and forth and seeing how beautiful it is. Okay, let me go ahead. I'm going to secure this thread in here. You guys, I know I'm a total nut, but let's go ahead and switch the camera view. We've got this right here, and I'm going to switch it to the front camera view. Okay, you guys, that is a binding video on tips and tricks that I use when I am binding. And you know, binding a quilt really is just so simple. It goes so fast, and it's really a lot of fun. Let me stand up and show you what the quilting on this quilt ended up looking like. So you can see right here that it isn't washed yet, so I still have to wash it. I like to put my binding on first before I throw it in the wash. I will use color catchers, and I will show you what the result of the color catchers are. I'll probably put 2 or 3 color catchers in here with this fabric. But the fabric that's in this bundle is from Riley Blake Designs, so that's definitely a good manufacturer, and the dye lot should be stable. We will definitely have some caught by the binding. Okay, look at this quilting, like on the red buffalo plaid. You can kind of see it on there. And where we did the gradual straight lines, but we're not having perfect straight lines. And then the gradual just wave to it. And look at how beautiful that looks on there. It just is so beautiful. I love it. So you guys, I am so excited. I know some of you guys have your quilt tops done. I'm so excited to see your quilts. I know there's some finished quilt tops out there of you guys using your own stash of big, beautiful florals and other prints. But don't, Mary, the hand binding is definitely relaxing. And it's also a luxurious opportunity to just pause from life. And it's, for me, it's a feeling of luxury that I can pause from life long enough to just sit there and hand stitch and to reflect on life. And it's such a luxuriousness activity to me that I can sit and just hand stitch. And I see that as such a luxury and such a beautiful thing to do. So that's how I feel about hand stitching. But whether you're on a machine or whether you're hand stitching, both of them are fantastic. And for quilts that say are for my grandchildren or for my kids when they were really, really little, I actually definitely machine quilted the binding because I wanted their quilt to be something that they wanted when they were sick, whether they threw up or whatever, that could be washed often and frequently. Oh, another tip, whenever I'm hand binding, every so often I'll knot my thread as I'm doing my stitches, and I'll just put a little extra knot in there so that if the stitch does break, it's definitely knotted every so often and it won't unravel. I've never had any of my hand quilting come undone though. So you guys, I'm so excited about the Modern Squared Chic Quilt. I think I designed this to accommodate beautiful large scale fabrics. This pattern is available if you want it. I'll try to make a blog post that summarizes all of my binding tips and tricks and techniques that you can have as a download, and I'll try to get that prepared and ready to go ahead and publish. On Monday, we are starting the Live Well, Live Strong Quilt Sew Along again. We aren't going to start stitching yet because I want everybody to get their patterns and to have them ready. We're going to talk about fabric selection. We're going to talk about how to take your pattern and put it into a binder so that you have it available. Well, I like my pattern in a binder. Maybe you guys don't, but I put it in the binder so then I have all of the wellness worksheets in here that I've done that are, you know, for you guys to download and print off and to put notes in there as your journey. So the Live Well, Live Strong quilt is a modern quilt that takes traditional blocks and you stitch them together and you make a modern, beautiful quilt. It comes in a 60 by 60 inch, or it also comes in a negative space, and the negative space is like, it can be queen, king size, or full size. So I don't have all the samples right here with me. And this year we are also doing the foundation piece blocks. So here is the Shine quilt block. It's 20 by 20 inches. The total quilt top for this, and that's the Shine quilt block, and this is the Belong, because we want to belong to communities and have healthy relationships, and we want to have healthy boundaries with people and with things in our lives, right? So that's a traditional shoe fly block. This is definitely a skill building quilt where you're going to learn how to match your points as you're joining blocks together. So it starts out very simple and it gradually, it definitely is a skill builder. So go get your patterns if you want to. The Live Well, Live Strong patterns are available at stitchesquilting.com. You can go ahead and pick those up, and they're available. The sew along will start on Monday. We won't start sewing next week, but we are going to organize all of our things and go through some different tips and tricks for things. So join me on the sew along as we sew each block. We're going to work on the block topic in our personal lives in just a private way that you know, so say the first block is called fuel. So, and that one is about eating healthy, sleeping adequately, getting enough water in your body. And we each can work on things in just small incremental growth, and do it week by week. So anyways, I'm super excited. We're going to make 2 blocks a week, so that it's a 3-month sew along. We will take some breaks during the holidays of a week off and a week off different times so that we aren't overwhelmed, because this isn't anything about overwhelm. Love you guys so much. Thank you for helping me. Thank you for being here. I cannot wait to see all of your beautiful quilts. Machine quilt them if you can, or if you send them to a long armor. I can't wait to see everything that you do. So thanks for being there, you guys, and I'll be back on Monday. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.